Let's bring in our CBSN political contributors in Washington. Zeke Miller is White House reporter for the Associated Press, and Sabrina Siddiqui is political reporter for The Guardian. All right, well, since Tuesday afternoon, these two stories have come out about key questions in the Russia investigation. Sabrina, when you look at these stories together, how have they changed the trajectory and the politics of the investigation, you think?
Well, I don't think that they've changed the trajectory of the investigation. They may have slightly shifted some of the politics, which in many ways distracts from the core of what we've learned over the past year. You now have the Trump White House and supporters of the president saying that the fact that Hillary Clinton's campaign funded in part alongside the DNC this dossier, it somehow means that the entire Russia investigation is fake news and a witch hunt. That's obviously not the case. Robert Mueller is looking into ties between the Trump campaign and Moscow. We know that those ties did exist between certain associates of Trump and the Kremlin, and there was obviously an effort, according to the intelligence community, to sway the election in favor of Trump. So that fundamental fact has not changed, but I think that what's clear is the Clinton campaign, or those close to her, were not necessarily forthcoming about their role in funding the dossier, perhaps because they felt like it could be discredited and seen as partisan, when in fact many of the contents of that dossier have been substantiated by the intelligence community.
And Zeke, let me ask you, we heard Brian Fallon there say he didn't know if Hillary Clinton was aware of the campaign's connection to Fusion GPS. Politically speaking, how important a question is that?
It will certainly be very important, from the political aspect. I mean, for Robert Mueller's investigation, that's an entirely separate deal. Can he and his team corroborate, the allegations in the dossier, corroborate, everything else that they're looking at, they're investigating in the broader Russian investigation. But this is Washington. This investigation is always going to be colored by politics. The outcome of the investigation also will, to a certain extent, be colored by politics, and certainly the implications of it, if they find anything. That's a political question for this country, for the Republican Party, for the nation to deal with. And here, certainly the credibility of that dossier took a substantial hit now that it has been revealed that the Clinton campaign was behind it, and additionally that the Campaign Legal Center, which is a watchdog group, a nonprofit watchdog group in Washington, filed a FEC complaint alleging that some of these revelations sort of seem to indicate that potentially the Clinton campaign and the DNC, by funneling this money through their law firm, tried to skirt campaign finance rules about disclosure. So all of those things together seem to raise a lot of questions for the way the Democrats handled this, and that will make it easier for the president to sort of wiggle himself away from some of the thornier bits of this.
All right, let's turn to another topic. I want to talk about retiring Arizona Senator Jeff Flake. His Senate colleague, Democrat Chris Coons, has a new op-ed in the New York Times titled "Why Jeff Flake's Exit Should Scare Democrats." And he writes, quote, "As for Democrats, there should be no sense of satisfaction in what is happening to the Republican Party. The balance of two functioning political parties has been essential to our country's success." Sabrina, what is the point that Coons is making here?
Well, I think that there are 2 points he's making. One is that we've obviously seen an era of great polarization in Washington, and both parties shifting more toward ideological extremes. And so in many ways that has led to the dysfunction that you see on Capitol Hill and the inability of Congress to get big things done, to work with a bipartisan consensus. So if you lose the moderate voices like Jeff Flake, Bob Corker, people who might be willing to reach across the aisle, that just contributes to the lack of action on substantive issues. And then there's the other point that Coons is making, where as the parties move more and more toward ideological extremes, does that mean that there is no place for centrists in their own parties? And right now we're seeing that manifest itself with the Republican Party, but you see some shades of that with this Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, this lingering divide between progressives and centrists. And I think that what Coons is saying is that, look, today it's Republicans, tomorrow it could be us, and Democrats shouldn't take that for granted.
Yeah, Zeke, what about that? I mean, is there now on both sides here a pull to those more extreme, far left, far right positions given the political climate?
Yeah, I think Sabrina's 100% right there. I mean, that's a warning to both parties. Part of the challenge here is that, for decades, a generation or two, we've talked about politics as a left and right spectrum, Democrats on the left, Republicans on the right, and sort of their extremes that way. And I think what we've seen in the last, 4 years, certainly maybe a little bit longer, is that's no longer holding true. There's this populist, nationalist versus establishment divide that doesn't fit on that spectrum. And we've seen it, in terms of liberal internationalism and isolationism on the foreign policy side of things, and that doesn't always line up, form together in a neat line. And I think both parties are losing the basic vocabulary of how to talk about, how to describe themselves, and also how to talk. And if they can't describe themselves in one sentence or one paragraph or one platform, it's going to be awfully hard to reach across the aisle and create substantive, legislation, bipartisan legislation on Capitol Hill, reach compromise. And that's going to be a problem that both of these parties are going to be struggling with for quite some time.
Right. Those labels, I think, are what a lot of people sort of reject, right? This notion that if you're in this particular category, then therefore you must feel this way. And that's not always the case. As we've certainly seen, folks who maybe voted for President Obama, who went ahead and voted for President Trump. So that's something it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Meantime, Sabrina, let me ask you, Senators Corker, Flake, and McCain have all spoken out against the president, but the majority of Senate Republicans have refused to follow. Is there any evidence that Flake's call to arms for Republicans is being answered?
Not necessarily, and I think the vast majority of Republicans on Capitol Hill still ascribe to the belief that there's no political upside to picking a fight with this president, that he still has a very strong hold over the Republican base. And so there is one aspect where they don't want to risk their own reelection prospects by angering a president who has shown he's willing to take on Republican incumbents if need be. And then there are those who believe that they will need his support to enact Republican priorities such as tax reform, health care, repealing and replacing Obamacare, I should say. And then you have now this growing chorus of Republicans, you mentioned Flake, Corker, and McCain, who are sort of saying enough is enough. They no longer feel like they can defend what they believe is indefensible. The trouble is that with Flake and Corker leaving the Senate, they're not necessarily giving Republican primary voters an alternative. They're not really presenting an electoral opportunity for Republican primary voters to reject so-called Trumpism, which they are saying is a threat to democracy. So it's just not clear how this movement gains steam unless there are more Republicans who are willing to, one, actually run on an anti-Trump platform, and two, undermine some of his legislative priorities to send a message that they're not willing to accept his conduct.
Zeke, let me ask you, House Ways and Means Chairman Kevin Brady said Wednesday changes to retirement savings accounts could be part of a Republican tax overhaul, contradicting the president who pledged, quote, no changes to your 401k. How significant, Zeke, a sticking point could that be?
I mean, I think this is the clearest indication in a week where there have been a lot of indications on this front that Republicans aren't afraid of the president, aren't afraid of his rhetoric. Certainly, they have to worry about his voters, but in terms of the president, this is one of those issues where the Trump voter base doesn't get mobilized over something like this. It's not necessarily seen as going against the president from a partisan standpoint. It's a sort of a technical and important policy one. But here, the president put out a very clear marker. And the person that he has essentially delegated writing his tax plan to says, not so fast. This might need to be on the table. So this is a sign that Republicans don't really fear the White House, and that the tax plan that Congress works up might not be something that the president is all that happy with, as much as he depends. The success or failure of his first year in office largely depends on the passage of that legislation. He might not be happy with it, with what comes out of the Hill.
Well, but Zeke, when he's been unhappy in the past and he continues to make that known, he doesn't usually show signs of backing down, right? And when you talk about 401k, this is language people understand, right? 401ks, you get that, people's ears perk up. Could it be that we're going to start hearing from the president more and more about this, if in fact there is a continued insistence on the part of House Republicans to keep these 401k changes perhaps on the table? Because, the president has said time and time again how much he is looking out for the working class people of America. When you talk about 401ks and savings, there is the bully pulpit of the presidency and Twitter, frankly, that, again, he's doubled down on in the past when he's faced opposition.
Oh, absolutely. And he can sort of make this sort of draw a line in the sand and say that this is something that is non-negotiable for him. But in doing so, what Brady and others on Capitol have argued is that they need to cut some of these breaks somewhere, some of these popular breaks, if they want to make sure that this tax plan doesn't bust the budget. And there are certainly enough Republicans on Capitol Hill who've raised hay over the last 8 years, 2 decades and longer about sort of rising deficits. And there's several who say they'll vote no. And this could be the sort of showdown that the entire fate of this legislation can ride on, and that is important. That could have catastrophic implications for the president, but also for Republicans in Congress who really need this. It's impossible to overstate how important passing something that says tax reform on it, just how ambitious it has to be to cost them, to protect them next fall, isn't clear. But they need something, and this is the sort of thing that could blow the entire thing up.
Yes, it is a complicated issue, to say the least. Zeke Miller and Sabrina Siddiqui, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.